The December wind cut through Manhattan like a blade, carrying the first promise of snow across the empty streets of Lincoln Center. It was 8:47 p.m. on a Thursday evening in 1973, and Andy Williams pulled his wool coat tighter as he stepped out of the NBC studios on West 67th Street. The taping of his Christmas special had run long again, 3 hours of retakes because the orchestra couldn't get the strings right on the Christmas song, but Andy never complained. Perfection took time, and his audience deserved nothing less. His driver, Robert, was waiting by the black Lincoln Continental, engine running to keep the interior warm. "Home, Mr. Williams?" he asked, already reaching for the door handle. But Andy paused, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Somewhere in the distance, barely audible above the city's constant hum, he heard something that made his heart stop. A child's voice, clear and pure, drifting through the winter night like a prayer. "Wait," Andy said quietly, holding up his hand. "Do you hear that?" Robert listened, his weathered face concentrating. After 30 years driving for entertainers in New York City, he'd learned to pay attention when they heard something others missed. "Sounds like singing, sir. Coming from over there, near the theater." Andy Williams had heard thousands of voices in his career. He'd worked with Ella Fitzgerald, Frank Sinatra, Nat King Cole, voices that could make grown men weep. But this voice, this small, trembling voice floating through the December darkness, carried something he hadn't heard in years. Pure, unfiltered emotion. No technique, no training, just a child pouring his soul into the night air. "I need to find where that's coming from," Andy said, already walking toward the sound. Robert followed at a respectful distance, his hand instinctively moving toward the pepper spray in his coat pocket. The streets around Lincoln Center could be unpredictable after dark, but he'd learned not to argue when Mr. Williams got that particular look in his eyes. The voice grew stronger as they rounded the corner onto Broadway. There in the doorway of a closed delicatessen sat a boy who couldn't have been more than 12 years old. He was bundled in a coat too big for his small frame, his dark hair visible beneath a knit cap that had seen better days. In front of him sat an open violin case with a few scattered coins and dollar bills, and in his hands was a piece of paper with song lyrics written in careful pencil. Tommy Chen had been sitting in that doorway for 3 hours, his fingers numb with cold, his voice growing hoarser with each song. His mother was working her second shift at the laundromat 6 blocks away, and his younger sister was home with the neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, who watched her in exchange for help with her English homework. Tommy knew he should be home, but their rent was due tomorrow, and they were still $47 short. He discovered he could sing 6 months ago, quite by accident. The radio in their tiny apartment had been playing Moon River during one of Andy Williams' television specials, and Tommy had found himself humming along. His mother had looked up from her sewing, tears in her eyes. "Sing it again, mijo," she'd whispered. "Please sing it again." That night she told him about his father, who died when Tommy was 3, and how he used to sing that same song when he rocked Tommy to sleep as a baby. Now Tommy sang that song every night on Broadway, because it seemed to touch something in the hurried commuters and late-night workers who passed by. The lawyers rushing home to their brownstones, the nurses finishing their shifts at Mount Sinai, the off-duty taxi drivers grabbing coffee before the overnight shift. Something about that melody, about the way a 12-year-old boy could make Moon River sound both hopeful and heartbreaking, made them slow down, reach into their pockets, and drop whatever change they could spare. Andy Williams stood 20 feet away, pressed against the brick wall of a closed bookstore, listening to his signature song sung by a child who probably didn't even know who he was. The boy's voice cracked slightly on the high notes, but his phrasing was intuitive, natural. He understood the song's emotional core in a way that seasoned professionals often missed. When Tommy reached the line about waiting round the bend, his voice dropped to almost a whisper, and Andy felt something tighten in his chest. "That's my song," Andy murmured to Robert, who was standing quietly beside him. "That's my song, and he's singing it like he wrote it himself." When Tommy finished Moon River, he carefully folded the lyrics and pulled out another sheet of paper. This one was harder to read in the dim light from the street lamps, but Andy could see it was handwritten, the words slightly smeared as if the paper had gotten wet. The boy cleared his throat, took a sip from a thermos that probably contained lukewarm tea, and began singing, "The Way You Look Tonight." His pronunciation wasn't perfect, his voice wasn't trained, but there was something authentic about the way he interpreted each song that made Andy's chest ache. This wasn't performance for the sake of performance. This was survival disguised as art. This was a child using the only gift he had to try and help his family make it through another month. After the third song, Tommy counted the money in his violin case. $13.67. Not enough, but more than yesterday. He was preparing to pack up his things when he noticed a man in an expensive-looking coat standing in the shadows across the street. For a moment, panic fluttered in Tommy's stomach. Sometimes the police moved street performers along, and sometimes there were people who weren't safe to be around after dark. But the man stepped forward into the light, and Tommy could see that he was older. Maybe his father's age if his father had lived. He had kind eyes and silver hair, and he was walking slowly, his hands visible, the way adults moved when they didn't want to frighten children. "That was beautiful," Andy said softly, stopping about 6 feet away from Tommy's makeshift performance space. "How long have you been singing?" Tommy looked up, trying to gauge whether this stranger was safe. His mother had taught him to be careful, but she'd also taught him to be polite. "About 6 months, sir, since my mom lost her first job." Andy nodded, his heart breaking a little more. "You have a gift, son. A real gift. What's your name?" "Tommy Chen. And thank you, sir, but I know I'm not very good yet. I'm still learning." The boy's humility was almost painful to witness. Here was genuine talent coupled with the kind of modesty that Andy rarely saw in the entertainment industry anymore. "Tommy," Andy said, "I'd like to ask you something, but first, may I sit down? These old bones don't like standing in the cold for too long." Tommy nodded eagerly, scooting over to make room on the concrete step. Andy settled beside him, noting how thin the boy was beneath his oversized coat. "I'm curious about something," Andy continued. "Why do you know all the words to these particular songs? They're not exactly what most kids your age listen to." Tommy's face brightened for the first time since Andy had been watching. "My mom has all these old records that belonged to my father. He died when I was little, but she kept his whole collection. Frank Sinatra, Nat King Cole, Dean Martin, and this singer named Andy Williams who has the most beautiful voice I've ever heard. Sometimes at night, after my sister falls asleep, Mom and I listen to his albums, and she tells me stories about my father." Andy felt his breath catch. He looked at this earnest boy sitting beside him on a cold December night, singing songs to help pay his family's rent, with no idea that he was talking to the very performer he'd just praised. The irony was overwhelming, but more than that, Andy felt a profound sense of responsibility. Here was a child with real talent, struggling in circumstances that no 12-year-old should have to face. "Tommy," Andy said carefully, "what would you say if I told you I might be able to help you and your mother?" The boy's eyes widened, but then he shook his head. "That's very kind, sir, but we don't take charity. Mom says we work for what we need." The pride in his voice was unmistakable, even as his small body shivered in the cold. "I wasn't talking about charity," Andy replied gently. "I was talking about opportunity. You see, Tommy, I know some people in the music business. People who are always looking for genuine talent, especially young talent that could be developed properly. Would you be interested in taking some singing lessons? Real lessons with a professional teacher?" Tommy stared at him, hope and disbelief warring in his expression. "We can't afford lessons, sir. We can barely afford groceries." Andy pulled a business card from his wallet, but instead of handing it over immediately, he took out a pen and wrote something on the back. "This is the name and phone number of a very good voice teacher I know. Her name is Margaret Ellis, and she works with young singers. I'm going to call her tomorrow and arrange for you to have lessons. No charge, Tommy. Consider it an investment in your future." "I don't understand," Tommy whispered. "Why would you do this for someone you just met?" Andy looked at this brave, talented boy and made a decision that would change both their lives. "Tommy, my name is Andy Williams. Those records your mother plays, those songs you've been singing, I recorded those." The color drained from Tommy's face. For a moment, Andy was afraid the boy might faint. You're Andy Williams? The real Andy Williams?" Andy nodded, smiling gently. "The real one. And Tommy, I want you to know that in all my years of performing, in all the concerts and recordings and television shows, I have rarely heard anyone sing my songs with the kind of heart you put into them tonight. You have something special, something that can't be taught, but it can be developed, nurtured, helped to grow into something magnificent. Tommy started to cry then, not the dramatic sobbing of a child having a tantrum, but the quiet, overwhelmed tears of someone who had been carrying too much weight for too long and suddenly felt some of that burden lifting. Andy reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a handkerchief, offering it to the boy. "There's more," Andy said softly. "I'm going to talk to some people I know about getting your mother some help finding better employment. Nothing that will embarrass her or make her feel like she's accepting charity. Just some connections to jobs that pay better than what she's doing now. Every parent deserves the chance to provide for their children without having to work themselves to exhaustion." Over the next 40 minutes, as the December wind grew colder and the first snowflakes began to fall, Andy Williams and Tommy Chen sat on that concrete step and talked. Andy learned about Tommy's dreams of maybe someday singing professionally, about how much he missed his father, about how scared he sometimes got when his mother worked late shifts and he had to take care of his little sister. Tommy learned about Andy's early days in the business, about the importance of education alongside musical training, about how success in entertainment required both talent and character. When Andy finally stood to leave, he pressed two things into Tommy's hands: the business card with Margaret Ellis's information and a crisp $100 bill. "This isn't charity," he said firmly when Tommy started to protest. "This is payment for one of the finest concerts I've attended all year. You earned this, Tommy. You earned it with your voice and your courage and your love for your family." As Andy walked back toward his car, where Robert was waiting patiently, he heard Tommy call out behind him, "Mr. Williams, thank you for stopping. Thank you for listening." Andy turned back one last time. "Tommy, promise me something. No matter what happens, no matter how your life changes, never lose that heart you put into your singing tonight. That's what makes you special. That's what makes you real." 3 weeks later, Margaret Ellis called Andy with a report that filled him with satisfaction. Tommy Chen was not only remarkably talented, but also dedicated, punctual, and eager to learn. His mother, Susan, had been offered a position as a translator for a law firm, work that paid 3 times what she'd been earning and had reasonable hours that allowed her to be home with her children. But Andy Williams never spoke publicly about that December night in 1973. He never mentioned it in interviews, never used it for publicity, never turned it into a heartwarming story for his television specials. Some acts of kindness, he believed, were meant to be private, their value measured not in public recognition, but in the lives they touched. 15 years later, in 1988, Andy Williams was performing at Carnegie Hall when his assistant brought him a note that had been delivered backstage. It was written on expensive stationery in careful handwriting. "Mr. Williams, you may not remember me, but in December of 1973, you changed my life on a street corner near Lincoln Center. Tonight, I'm singing backup vocals for Sarah Vaughan at the Blue Note, my first professional engagement in New York. I never forgot what you told me about singing from the heart. Your friend always, Tommy Chen." Andy folded the note carefully and put it in his jacket pocket. After the show, instead of attending the reception in his honor, he quietly slipped out of Carnegie Hall and walked the 12 blocks to the Blue Note. There, in the dimly lit jazz club, he watched from the back as a young man with a powerful, trained voice provided backing vocals for one of America's greatest singers. Tommy had grown tall and confident, but when he sang, Andy could still hear that 12-year-old boy who had poured his heart out on a cold December night. When the set ended, Tommy spotted Andy in the back of the club. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and the young man's face lit up with the same joy Andy had seen that night on Broadway. Tommy made his way through the crowd, and when he reached Andy, they embraced like the old friends they had become. "You kept your promise," Andy said softly. "You never lost your heart." Tommy Chen went on to become one of New York's most sought-after session singers, lending his voice to countless recordings and eventually establishing his own music school in Queens, where he taught children from struggling families. He never charged tuition for students who couldn't afford it, and above the entrance to his school, he hung a simple sign, "Sing from your heart. everything else can be taught. Today, that school has graduated over 300 young musicians, many of whom have gone on to successful careers in music. But more importantly, it has provided hope and opportunity to children who might otherwise have never known that their voices mattered, that their dreams were valid, that someone believed in their potential. And in Tommy Chen's office, in a frame next to photos of his successful students, hangs a faded business card with handwriting on the back. Margaret Ellis, voice teacher. And below that, in Andy Williams's distinctive script, for Tommy, sing with your heart. It's the only way that matters. A W. Because sometimes the most important performances don't happen on grand stages in front of thousands of people. Sometimes they happen on Cole Street corners, where dreams are waiting to be discovered and lives are ready to be changed forever. All it takes is someone willing to stop, to listen, and to believe in the power of a child's voice carrying hope through the winter night.